Something that continues to amaze me about Dark Souls and its sister games is how even over a decade later, there's still new ideas and new connections being made and uncovered. Recently I went back through Dark Souls 3 and was trying to make better sense of Yorshka, who always seemed to be in an odd place in the lore, but in the process of trying to understand her, I fell down a rabbit hole that uncovered even more about another character. And all of that has now convinced me that not just Yorshka, but also Dark Son Gwyndolin is a child of Crossbreed Priscilla. So now that that initial clickbaity band-aid has been ripped off, let's jump right into the pure schizoness of this theory. Let's start with their magics, because when we first meet either of the characters, they're not hostile, but once we anger them, then we find that they're both capable of some interesting spells. Priscilla's boss gimmick is her ability to turn invisible until she's taken enough damage to knock her out of it. But the more famous one is Gwyndolin's illusion over all of Anor Londo, projecting the image of his sister Guinevere and even the sun itself that's lighting up the city. Once we actually engage him, Gwyndolin also creates the illusion of an infinite hallway to fight us in, and appears to teleport away once we get close enough to strike him. And I can already hear some saying, yeah, but Ulasil also uses illusions, big deal, so let's look at something more concrete. With both of these characters, the identity of their fathers is much more concrete concept than the identity of their mothers. Gwyndolin is outright stated to be the son of Gwyn himself, and most would agree that Priscilla is either the daughter or at least creation of Seath the Scaleless. And if we assume that Gwyndolin is Priscilla's child, then we see some common threads throughout this lineage. All three of these characters are depicted as very pale, and if they have any, have white hair and clothing. And then there's the association with moonlight. Gwyndolin himself has the title of either Dark Moon or Dark Sun, and many of his items, such as the Dark Moon Bow, the Tin Dark Moon Catalyst, and even his clothing, the Moonlight Set, have references to, quote, moonlight magic. But Gwyndolin doesn't have a monopoly on this moonlight magic, because perhaps the most famous item in all of FromSoft's games is the Moonlight Greatsword itself, which we get in Dark Souls 1 by cutting off the tail of Seath the Scaleless, and the subsequent games in the Dark Souls series also continue to associate it with him. Soul of the Moonlight Butterfly also directly states that it is a, quote, creation of Seath the Scaleless. And then finally, all three of these characters are at least partial dragons, which is actually what made this whole thing click for me and started everything else falling into place. To actually explain this connection, let's take a closer look at Gwyndolin's model, because the strangest aspect of it for most people would be that his legs seem to be replaced by snakes, and this has always been a bit of an odd detail. But a lot of people just give up and simply chalk it up to FromSoft being a bit weird at times. But I believe, however, that this is actually an extremely significant detail to the very fundamentals of Gwyndolин's character. Because when we look at Gwyn and the rest of the gods, we see absolutely nothing like this. Gwyn himself seems to be normal, if a bit overcooked, and Guinevere seems to be the pinnacle of human ideals of beauty, and even the Nameless King takes after their father. Of these top movies and shakers of the Age of Fire, the only one that seems to have anything similar is Seath's tentacle legs and tail, which is all well and good, but still, how do we get from dragons to snake legs? Like most things in Dark Souls, it's an item description. Because when we looked at the Covetous Serpent strings in our playthroughs, most of us just saw the free extra souls and items, and forgot about the rest of the cryptic description at first. With those who tried to tie it into the rest of the lore fixated more on the in-your-face mysteries of just what the heck the primordial serpents were. But what I believe they missed turns out to be the connecting line between Gwyndolin and Seath. The rings say, quote, "The serpent is an imperfect dragon. Gwyndolin's abnormalities are manifesting themselves as snakes because he too is an imperfect dragon. Seath himself is arguably imperfect because of his lack of scales. His presumed child is an imperfect crossbreed, and her own child would then be an even further stray from the gray everlasting perfection of the dragons." Interesting statue tidbit that doesn't necessarily prove anything, but will help my speculations down the line, are all the statues in Anor Londo, or more specifically, the lack thereof. Because Gwyn has a very prominent statue, of course, and then Guinevere takes the spot to his left as the Princess of Sunlight, and there's even an empty plinth where the Nameless King presumably used to be. but completely absent from all these depictions is Gwyndolin. Speaking of the Nameless King, let's hop over to Dark Souls 3, where our boy Gwyndolin is in a bit of a situation, being slowly vored and puppeted by Aldrich, Devourer of Gods. Because when we fight Aldrich and put Gwyndolin out of his misery finally, two of the moves that we can later even transpose out of Aldrich's soul are the Dark Moon Longbow, which is Gwyndolin's returning weapon of choice, and interestingly, the Life Hunt Scythe, the main weapon of Priscilla. And a lot of people interpret the Life Hunt Scythe Miracle's description to mean that Aldrich is somehow pulling the idea of the scythe out of a dream he just so happens to be having of Priscilla, because the painting used to be nearby, I guess. But I'd argue the simpler answer is that he's receiving those dreams through Gwyndolin, because the other item we can get out of his soul also has nothing to do with Aldrich, but is instead also connected directly to Gwyndolin. And just a short elevator ride and invisible platform away, we find Yorshka, who, without this whole theory, has been a very confusing character that most haven't been able to make heads or fluffy tails of. And probably the only major rebuttal to this whole theory that I've heard so far is more to do with Priscilla's parentage. Most people like the theory that she's Guinevere's daughter, arguably just because we don't get good options for other goddesses. Velka and Fina only have vague references to simply existing, but that doesn't prevent this theory from being correct, it just makes it a bit more disturbing. Yorshka would force us to deal with that anyway. Yorshka is quite blatantly, we have Priscilla at home, having the same draconic horns, tail, and fur, and she repeatedly refers to Gwyn as her father, Guinevere as her sister, and Gwyndolin specifically as her, quote, elder brother. So obviously, Yorshka is the daughter of Gwyn, and heavily implied to be related to Priscilla in some way, presumably also as her daughter. And with Gwyndolin fitting into this, his serpentine deformities and associations with moonlight magic would suggest instead of being a full-blooded sibling with Guinevere and the Nameless King, he instead shares Yorshka's mother, presumably Priscilla. This could lead him to be much closer to his younger sibling, which is shown by him making Yorshka a member and eventually captain of his Darkwind Blades, and even being the one to give her her name. So now that the theory's been laid out, let's make some conjecture based on it. I would propose that Gwyndolin is essentially being treated as a bastard child. Most monarchies in the real world have traditionally had their inheritance go through the male lineage, so after Gwyn eventually either dies or leaves his throne, the Nameless King would inherit Gwyn's position as Lord of Sunlight and Chief of the Gods. If the Nameless King died, or stepped down without an heir of his own, or if he was disowned like what eventually happened, presumably Gwyndolin, the second son, would inherit instead. Being a quarter dragon, however, that probably wouldn't fly with Gwyn, even if he seemed willing to at least keep Gwyndolin around as his child. The description on Gwyndolin's clothes say, quote, "The power of the moon was strong in Gwyndolin, and thus he was raised as a daughter," which made most people understandably believe that the moonlight magic was an inherently feminine trait. But notice that it doesn't actually say that, simply that it was the reason why Gwyndolin was raised as a daughter. And even Guinevere, arguably the most feminine of the gods, is still the princess of sunlight. This moonlight association with Seath, and thus the dragons, would instead be a driving factor for Gwyn to shuffle around the inheritance of his position. With Gwyndolin treated as his daughter, Guinevere would then be the second in line to inherit as the eldest daughter. There are even similar real-world parallels to this. In many cultures, castrating someone could be used as a tool to keep them from inheriting positions of power, as along with the physical removal, this also removes their ability to produce heirs of their own, thus ending the lineage. It also has the side effect of the now eunuch to start developing more feminine traits, or at least lose their masculine ones. Curiously, a similar practice in some areas was blinding an heir to prevent them from inheriting, and Gwyndolin's Crown of the Dark Sun interestingly covers the wearer's eyes, and Gwyndolin seems to either agree with, or at least continues following the idea that he isn't an heir to his father's position. Gwyn burns himself, the Nameless King is exiled, and Guinevere flees Anor Londo with the rest of the gods, save one. Even as the last of the gods in Anor Londo, Gwyn's last child and last heir, we curiously don't see Gwyndolin step forward to take the position. Instead, he hides in his father's tomb and rules from the shadows through an illusion of his sister Guinevere still presiding over the capital. And to put a nice bow on the whole thing, FromSoft is often accused of simply recycling old ideas and new arrangements, and would reuse exactly what I'm proposing they did in Dark Souls, later on in Elden Ring. Because there we have Morgoth, who is arguably the rightful heir to Godfrey's position within the Golden Lineage, and rules over the capital of Leyndell as its king. However, Morgoth is similarly deformed by the Omen Curse, which causes massive horns and growths throughout his body, marking him out as the antithesis of what the monarchy is presumably standing for. However, also trying to do his best to uphold the ideals of that monarchy, and thus ruling by obscuring his identity.